Hey guys, tonight we begin with the city of Rome itself, where you will wake up before dawn in a 6-story apartment building that is absolutely on fire with noise and possibly just on fire, and discover that being a Roman citizen was significantly less dignified than the marble statues suggest. Then we move to the most dangerous professional woman in the ancient world, a woman the emperor kept on retainer specifically because she was very good at ending people quietly, and who built an entire career out of knowing exactly how much of something was enough. After that, you become a nomenclator, the Roman slave whose entire existence was devoted to whispering names into a politician's ear at parties, which sounds almost manageable until you understand the consequences of getting one wrong. And finally, we pull back the curtain on the gladiatorial games, which turns out to have been not a brutal free-for-all, but a highly organised, medically supervised, commercially regulated industry that would have made a modern sports franchise manager feel quite at home. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You do not wake up gently in Rome. There is no gentle. The city does not believe in it. You wake up because something has gone wrong outside your window, and whatever it is, it involves shouting, and it has been going on for longer than you would like, and there is apparently no resolution in sight. You lie still for a moment on your straw mattress, which is technically a mattress in the same way that a puddle is technically water, and you stare at the ceiling of your rented room and think about all the choices that led you here. The ceiling does not respond. The shouting continues. Welcome to the insula. This is where you live. Not in a house with a garden and a pleasant interior courtyard and a little fountain the way the wealthy Romans do, but in a rented room in a multi-story apartment block that rises 6 or 7 floors above the street in a stack of connected spaces that are, depending on your income and luck, either tolerable or genuinely hazardous. The upper floors are cheaper. You're on an upper floor. You already know what that means, which is that you carry everything you need up a lot of stairs, and carrying things up a lot of stairs in Rome is its own kind of daily punishment. The building around you creaks slightly, the way buildings in Rome often do, because Roman insulae were not always built with what you might call long-term structural integrity in mind. They were built quickly, built cheaply, built tall, and built by landlords who were primarily interested in collecting rent rather than in the longevity of the structure. Fires happen. Collapses happen. Both of these things happen with enough regularity that there are actual Roman laws about how tall a building is allowed to be, laws which were written precisely because someone noticed that the buildings kept falling down or burning up, and that this was creating a problem. The laws did not fully solve the problem. The buildings are still tall, the buildings still burn, you're still inside one. Good morning. You swing your legs off the mattress and feel the floor, which is cold in the way that stone floors are always cold, which is to say completely and without apology. You have slept in your tunic because it is the sensible thing to do, and because the alternative is being cold for longer before you can get dressed, and you are already an extremely practical person. You look around your room, which is a single room, because you are not wealthy enough for multiple rooms, and take stock of what you have: a mattress, a small table, a clay lamp that is not currently lit because oil costs money, a few personal items arranged in the way you arrange things when space is limited, and you're trying to maintain at least the suggestion of order. It is fine. It is enough. It is distinctly not what you would choose, given other options, but other options are not currently available to you, and so fine and enough will have to do. The noise outside is growing rather than diminishing, which tells you the street has fully woken up, and that the window of relative quiet, the brief period between the deepest part of the night and the true beginning of morning activity, has already closed. Rome sleeps, when it sleeps at all, in the very middle of the night. By the time dawn is approaching, the city is already moving again, and by actual dawn it is entirely, aggressively, unapologetically alive. The carts are rolling. In the city proper, wheeled vehicles are not permitted during daylight hours, so every merchant and supplier who needs to move goods through the streets has to do it at night, which means that from dusk to roughly sunrise, Rome sounds like a continuous rolling, rattling argument between wooden wheels and stone paving. You slept through most of it, or you almost slept through most of it, or you lay awake listening to it and telling yourself you were sleeping through it. Either way, it is over now, and the carts are gone, and what replaces them is something only slightly quieter. You stand up, run your hands through your hair, and accept the morning. There is no water in your room. There is no water on your floor of the building. Water is heavy, and the pipes that bring it to Rome deliver it to the street fountains and to the homes of people who can afford private connections, and you are not one of those people. So water for washing and drinking is something you go to get rather than something you have waiting for you. You will do that later. Right now, your first urgent concern is more immediate. You are hungry, and there is almost certainly nothing in your room to eat, because you do not have a kitchen. The insula has no kitchen. Most of the rooms in the insula have no means of cooking at all, partly for space reasons and partly because of the fire risk. And what happens to a building when someone's attempt to cook in a small enclosed space goes wrong is something Rome has learned about the hard way on multiple occasions. So you do not cook, you go out and you eat what the city provides, which is quite a lot actually, because Rome has thought about this problem and arrived at a solution. The thermopolium is the solution, or one of the solutions. It sits on the ground floor of almost every block, sometimes several to a block, a small commercial space with a stone counter built into the street frontage. The counter set with circular openings in which large ceramic vessels sit embedded, each one containing something warm. You know this before you even see it because you can smell it from halfway up the stairs, a complex layered smell of cooked grain and spiced wine and something involving onions and possibly fish sauce, that sharp, fermented, omnipresent Roman condiment that turns up in virtually every dish and which you have, at this point, completely stopped noticing because the entire city smells of it and your nose has simply surrendered. You accept this. Everyone accepts this. You take the stairs down carefully because the stairs are steep and unlit, and you have made the mistake before of taking them too fast in the morning when your eyes have not quite adjusted. The stairwell has its own smell, which is the smell of many people living in close proximity over a long period of time and which is, charitably, robust. You reach the street. The street hits you all at once. It is loud. It is immediately, persistently loud in the way that Rome is always loud once the carts have cleared out and the people have taken over, which is a different kind of loud, more variable and more human, voices and footsteps and animals and the sound of someone nearby hammering something, for reasons that are not immediately clear. The street is narrow enough that two people with baskets can almost not pass each other comfortably, and it is already busy, already full of the daily movement of a city that contains somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, all of whom need to be somewhere, and most of whom are not particularly concerned about whether you need to be somewhere too. You step into the flow of it and let it carry you the short distance to the thermopolium on the corner. The man behind the counter knows you, or knows your face, which in this context is essentially the same thing. You exchange the kind of minimal acknowledgement that works between people who see each other every morning and have reached a comfortable level of familiarity that does not require actual conversation. He hands you a small bowl of something that is mostly grain with liquid in it, warm and savoury and thickened, and a piece of bread that is fresh enough to be good and dense enough to last in your stomach for several hours, which is the primary quality you're interested in. You eat standing at the counter, which is how most people eat here, leaning slightly against the stone, watching the street move past you, letting the food do its work. There is wine too, heavily watered, more water than wine, technically wine in the same way your mattress is technically a mattress, but warm and slightly sweet and fine for the morning. You drink it, you feel slightly more like a functional person. The day is already organising itself around you whether you are ready for it or not. This is the thing about living in Rome without money, which is to say living in Rome the way most people in Rome actually live. The city does not wait for you to be ready. It is already in motion, already making its demands, already presenting its opportunities and its hazards with equal indifference. You have things to do today, errands to run, people to find, work to pursue or maintain, small obligations to honour. The Roman day is long and mostly spent outside because the rooms people live in are for sleeping, and the city is for everything else, and so you are outside, and you will be outside for most of what comes next. You walk, because in Rome walking is what you do. The wealthy are carried in litters by slaves, elevated above the street and the smell and the press of bodies, moving through the city as if through a slightly different version of it, where none of the unpleasant parts apply to them. You do not have slaves. You're not elevated. You're in the street, which means you're in the actual Rome, the one that is not polished marble and triumphal arches, but packed stone and crowded insulae, and the constant negotiation of space between too many people. You have learned to move through it efficiently, to read the flow, to know when to press forward and when to wait, and when someone moving fast in the opposite direction is not going to stop for you, and so you should be the one to stop. You navigate, you adapt. This is what Rome asks of you every single day, and by now it is almost instinctive. The streets of Rome are not a grid. They are not organised in any way that suggests someone sat down with a plan. They are the result of centuries of building on top of existing buildings, on top of paths that were once tracks worn into the ground by use, which means they turn without warning, narrow without warning, dead end without warning, and occasionally open suddenly into a square or a widened space that functions as a small market or gathering point, before narrowing again. You know your neighbourhood. You know which streets lead where and which ones look like they lead somewhere but don't, which shortcuts actually save time, and which ones have been blocked by ongoing construction, because Rome is always under construction somewhere, always being modified and expanded and repaired, always producing rubble and noise and patches of chaos embedded in the daily movement of the city. The forums are the centre of public life, and the Forum of the Romans, the oldest one, the one everyone simply calls the Forum, is where half the city's business happens, legal and commercial and social and political all at once. You pass through it at some point in the morning, as you do most mornings, not necessarily because you have business there, but because it is the city's living room, the place where information moves most freely, where you can absorb the current state of things without having to ask anyone directly. There are lawyers arguing cases in front of small crowds. There are money changers at their tables. There are people selling things, and people buying things, and people who appear to be doing nothing but who are actually waiting very specifically for someone, and people who have stopped to talk, and whose conversation has expanded to include whoever happened to be standing nearby. There is a statue at the centre of almost every open space you pass, frequently of someone you're only vaguely aware of, commemorating an action you would have to think hard to remember. The city is saturated with its own history in the form of stone and bronze, and you walk through it every day, and most days you barely notice it. You notice the smell of the street because the smell of the street is unavoidable. The Romans do not have a sewage system that reaches every building. The Cloaca Maxima drains some of it, the great sewer that runs beneath the city and empties into the Tiber, and the street drains catch some of the rest. But the gap between what the drainage system handles and what the city produces is filled in by other means, principally by chamber pots emptied from upper floor windows, and by the general residue of an enormous number of people and animals occupying a dense urban space. The law technically requires that you give warning before emptying something from a window. The law is not always followed. You have learned to move through certain streets with your attention slightly heightened, which is a polite way of saying you have learned to pay attention to what might be falling from above. This is simply a skill that Roman life requires. The baths are the part of the day you actually look forward to. The thermae, the public bathing complexes, are the great democratic amenity of Roman urban life, open to essentially everyone for a nominal fee that is low enough to be within reach of all but the most desperate, and on certain days when an emperor or wealthy patron wants to appear generous, free entirely. You go in the afternoon, when the heat of the day has peaked and the baths are doing their best business, when the largest number of people have made the same calculation that this is the right moment to be clean and warm and temporarily free from the responsibilities of the street. You have a regular place you go, not the largest or most spectacular of the city's bathing complexes, but the one that is close enough to be convenient and old enough to have worked out most of its operational difficulties. You start in the changing room and leave your things in a wooden cubby, which you do with the slightly heightened alertness of someone who is aware that theft from bath changing rooms is extremely common, and that the slave watching the cubbies is not always watching closely enough. Then you move through the sequence of rooms that gives the Roman bath its particular pleasure. The tepidarium first, the warm room, which is already an immediate improvement on the temperature outside and which gives your body a chance to adjust before you press further in. The caldarium next, the hot room, where the air is thick with steam and the pool of water is warm enough to be startling when you first step in, and where you sit and let the heat work its way through your muscles and accept, for a few minutes, that this is actually pleasant. The heat opens something up in you, the tension you carry in your back and shoulders, the physical accumulation of bad mattresses and narrow stairs and stone streets, and the general effort of being a person in a demanding city begins, slowly and reluctantly, to loosen. The frigidarium is the cold plunge at the end, which tradition says is good for you and which is, regardless of its health benefits, intensely effective at making you feel suddenly and completely awake. You surface from it blowing out breath, and someone nearby does the same, and the shared absurdity of the moment produces the kind of small involuntary solidarity that the baths are very good at creating. You are briefly, genuinely, not thinking about anything except the cold water and your own body's response to it, and this is in its way a form of rest that your room at night cannot always provide. The baths are also where you hear things. This is not incidental to their purpose. Romans understand that putting large numbers of people together in a relaxed and undifferentiated social environment is one of the most reliable ways to move information through a city, and information moves through the baths like steam through the rooms, warm and ambient and unavoidable. You hear who's been condemned and who has been acquitted. You hear which senator said something inadvisable at dinner the night before. You hear the rumour about grain prices which may or may not be accurate, and the story about the gladiator from last month's games that is probably exaggerated but is being repeated anyway, because it is a good story and Rome is very fond of good stories whether they are entirely accurate or not. You absorb all of it without trying to, the same way you absorb the heat and the steam, and you take it with you when you leave, part of the daily accumulation of information that lets you navigate the city's social landscape with at least some sense of what is actually happening. The afternoon moves toward evening. The light changes over the forum. The volume of the street begins its shift, the commercial business of the day wrapping up, the social arrangements of the evening beginning to form. If you have an invitation to dinner somewhere, this is when you start thinking about it. If you do not, which is more likely on most evenings, you begin the negotiation with yourself about what to eat and where to eat it, which takes you back to the thermopolium, or to one of the small food sellers who move through the streets with trays, or to a cook shop tucked into a side street where the food is slightly more elaborate, and the company of strangers fills the room with a noise that is not quite the same as silence but which serves some of the same purposes. You return to the insula as the last of the light fades, climbing the stairs in the dimness, holding the wall the way you always do, and you sit for a moment on the edge of your mattress and let the city's sound continue around you, and below you, and above you. Someone is arguing one floor down. The building produces its usual assortment of sounds, the creaks and murmurs of a structure occupied by many people simultaneously, each one living their own version of this day. You have done what needed to be done. You are tired in the uncomplicated way that physical days produce, the kind of tired that does not require analysis, the kind that simply settles in and begins doing its work without your assistance. The lamp is not lit. The oil cost money. The darkness is fine. The city continues to be Rome outside your window, relentless and alive and entirely indifferent to your exhaustion. You close your eyes. It is, in its particular way, a perfectly ordinary day. This is what most days in Rome are. Not heroic, not tragic, not momentous. Just the accumulated weight of a city pressing against you constantly until you sleep. The insula is the first thing you need to understand about what Roman life actually was for most people, because it was where most people actually lived, and the distance between it and the marble-columned ideal of Roman civilization is substantial enough to deserve a moment of honest attention. The city of Rome at the height of the empire contained somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, which by ancient standards was an extraordinary concentration of humanity, and the infrastructure of the city strained continuously under the pressure of housing, feeding, and managing that many people in a space that had not been planned with such numbers in mind, but had simply grown into them, block by block, generation by generation, until the city was what it was, enormous, dense, crowded, and organised around a set of institutions that tried to manage the gap between the city's pretensions to grandeur and the daily reality of most of its inhabitants. The insulae, the apartment buildings, were the answer to the housing problem. They rose high because land was valuable and space was limited, and the alternative was not building enough to hold everyone, which was itself not an option. Augustus had tried to limit building heights with legislation specifying a maximum of about 70 Roman feet for new construction, and later emperors had adjusted this in various directions, but the basic pressure remained. Build up, build quickly, build as many rentable rooms as possible in as small a footprint as possible. The landlords who owned these buildings were in many cases large property investors who had no particular relationship with their tenants beyond the collection of rent, and the quality of construction in some of these buildings reflected this. The Roman architect and writer Vitruvius complained about the widespread use of materials that were too weak and construction methods that were too hasty, and his complaints were not abstract. Pliny the Elder noted that buildings in Rome seemed to be falling down constantly, and this was not rhetorical exaggeration. The city had a significant and ongoing problem with structural collapse, particularly in the insulae, which were asked to rise high while being built with relatively limited engineering investment. Fire was the other constant threat, and it shaped daily life in ways that went beyond simple caution. The Great Fire under Nero in 64 was the most famous of Rome's urban fires, but it was neither the first nor the last, and smaller fires were a recurring feature of life in the densely packed residential neighbourhoods. The lack of kitchens in upper-floor insular rooms was directly connected to fire risk. Every small stove or open flame represented a potential catastrophe in a building where the construction was wooden in significant parts, and the rooms were packed close together and water access was limited. Some residents used small braziers for heat in the cold months, and these were their own risk. But the alternative was a cold room in a Roman winter, which in the northern Italian climate was a genuine hardship, and people made the calculation that cold was the more immediate problem. The vigils, the night watchmen who served as Rome's fire brigade, patrolled the streets and were authorised to break into properties where they suspected fire hazard, but their effectiveness was limited, and the city burned anyway, periodically, sometimes in small fires that gutted a single building, and sometimes in larger events that remapped entire neighbourhoods. You know all of this the way you know everything about Rome that you have lived inside of long enough. You know it in your body rather than your mind. You know which buildings in your neighbourhood feel solid underfoot and which have a quality of slight uncertainty, a tendency to transmit vibration in ways that make you walk through them without quite trusting the floor. You know which landlords maintain their properties and which collect rent and send no one when the stairwell develops a new crack or the roof over the top floor begins to admit rain. You know the fire risk the way you know the weather risk, as a permanent background condition rather than an acute alarm, something that shapes behaviour without dominating thought. Your building has survived this long. It will probably survive longer. You do not think about the exceptions to this pattern very much, because the exceptions are not useful to think about. They are simply where you are. What you do think about, on a morning when the light is changing from black to the deep blue that comes just before actual dawn, is the day's practical requirements. Water is the first of them. You have a clay jug in the corner that you keep as full as you can manage, but the jug is not full this morning, and it needs to be. The nearest street fountain is 2 blocks and a turn to the left, a public fountain fed by one of the aqueducts that bring Rome its water from sources in the hills, a continuous flow of remarkably clean water moving through a system of channels and pipes that represents, in engineering terms, one of Rome's genuine achievements. The water that arrives at the street fountain is cold and clean in a way that most Romans, who have lived inside this system long enough to take it entirely for granted, would only notice if it stopped. It has not stopped. It flows constantly, overflowing into a channel in the street that carries the excess away, and the people of the neighbourhood come to it in the morning with their jugs and their buckets and their various containers and fill what they need and carry it back. This is the morning errand that cannot be skipped. You carry the jug down the stairs and through the street, moving against the current of people who are also beginning their mornings, and you fill it at the fountain, which is a stone basin with a carved spout from which water pours continuously, and you exchange nods with the woman who arrives at the same time and whom you have been nodding to at this fountain for 2 years without ever learning her name, which is the kind of relationship that Rome produces in abundance. Neighbouring strangers, familiar unknown. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. People whose faces are as recognised as those of close friends and whose histories are entirely opaque. You fill the jug and carry it back up the stairs and set it down carefully, and feel the small satisfaction of a morning's first task completed, which is the kind of satisfaction that matters more when tasks are what you actually have. The streets of Rome produce a particular quality of sensory experience that you have been inside for long enough to have ceased to notice most of it, which means that when you try to describe it, you have to reach back to the early days, when you still noticed. The smell is what hits new arrivals first, the complex layered smell of a dense urban environment without comprehensive sanitation, which is not simply unpleasant, although it is that, but also specific in its components. There is the animal smell, the horses and mules and oxen that pull carts and carry loads through the city, and the smell of their dung, which is a permanent feature of the stones, and which the men who collect it for use in the fullers' shops move through the streets gathering in the early mornings, a job that is at the very low end of the Roman hierarchy of respectable labour, but which someone must do. There is the smell of cooking from the thermopolia and cook shops, overlaid with the pervasive sharpness of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans put in and on everything, that features in recipes for bread and soup and meat and vegetables and wine preparations, and which is, once you have spent enough time in a Roman city, simply the smell of food. There is the smell of the fullers' shops, where urine is used to clean and process wool, and which have a distinctive quality that announces them well before you turn the corner to see them. There is the smell of the river, the Tiber, which receives a great deal of what Rome produces and returns it in the form of a particular muddy organic smell that drifts through the lower-lying parts of the city on warm days. All of this together produces something that is not simply the absence of the clean air you might theoretically prefer, but something active and specific, a scent that is the direct olfactory experience of density and commerce, and the particular chemistry of a very large number of people living very close together. The sounds layer on top of this. In the daytime hours, when the wheeled vehicles are off the street and the pedestrian population has full possession of the roads, the noise is generated by voices, by the hammering and sawing of construction that is happening on several streets in any given direction, by animals, by the criers who move through the neighbourhoods, advertising goods or announcing public events, by the occasional political announcements from officials whose job is to make sure the population knows what has been decided on their behalf. Children running and shouting produce their own ambient texture. A dispute between two men at a corner produces a brief elevation in the local sound level that resolves itself one way or another and fades back into the general volume. The thermopolium you pass regularly has a proprietor who greets regulars by name in a voice pitched to carry, and the greeting functions as both a welcome and a kind of advertising, a signal to the street that this establishment recognises its people and rewards their return. The Forum Romanum, the central public space of the city and in a real sense the centre of the Roman world, is worth standing in for a moment if you have never done so, because the experience of it is not quite what the historical distance makes it sound like. It is not a quiet temple to civic virtue. It is a working public space, noisy and busy and purposeful, full of people engaged in the actual mechanics of Roman public life at every level simultaneously. The law courts operate here, and the advocates speak their cases with the practiced projection of men who have spent careers learning to fill large outdoor spaces with their voices, and around each active case gathers a crowd of onlookers whose interest is sometimes genuine civic engagement and sometimes simple entertainment, because Roman legal cases could be genuinely dramatic, and the best advocates were something approaching public performers. The money changers and bankers have their tables in regular spots, conducting the financial business of the city in a constant stream of small transactions that, taken together, constitute a significant economic throughput. Merchants selling everything from writing materials to small religious objects operate in the colonnaded spaces around the edges. Slaves move on errands for their owners. Freedmen conduct their own business. Citizens exercise their various civic rights and obligations. It is everything at once, pressed into a space that is grand enough in its architecture to suggest imperial majesty, and human enough in its use to be full of the ordinary business of people who need to be somewhere and do something before lunch, or... You pass through it most mornings, not necessarily transacting any particular business, but absorbing the current state of things. This is itself a form of information gathering, the passive kind, where you simply put yourself in the space where information moves and allow the ambient content of other people's conversations to inform you about the current state of the city's various ongoing dramas. There is always something current, a trial of some significance, a political development that has shifted the positioning of various factions, a military situation on one of the frontiers that is generating either concern or relief, a scandal involving someone important enough to be interesting, and not so important that discussing it is genuinely dangerous, You do not seek this information out deliberately. You simply move through the forum, and it finds you, the way everything in a city this dense and this communicative eventually finds everyone who spends time in the spaces where it moves. The baths, the thermae, represent something genuinely remarkable about Roman civic culture, and you have lived inside that remarkability long enough to take it for granted, but can still appreciate it when you surface from the hot pool and someone nearby makes a comment about the water temperature and you agree, and for a moment you are two people, of whatever different situations in the outside world, simply occupying the same warm space with the same tired muscles and the same appreciation for the fact that this exists. The baths are one of the places where the theoretical Roman social ideal of a republic of citizens sharing public space and civic life comes closest to its actual instantiation. The admission fee is low enough to be genuinely inclusive across most of the population. The space itself is public. The activities it contains, washing, socialising, occasionally exercising in the attached palestra, hearing news and gossip, using the library if the complex has one, resting in the warm rooms, are genuinely available to most people who walk through the door. Slaves accompanying their masters are often permitted to use the facilities. Women may use separate hours or separate facilities depending on the specific complex. The poorest residents of the most overcrowded insulae stand in the same warm water as men of considerably greater means, and for the duration of the bath, the normal markers of status are literally stripped away. This does not mean that Roman society becomes equal at the baths. The social hierarchies reassert themselves the moment clothes are put back on and the street is re-entered. But for the duration, something different happens, and Rome is wise enough in its management of large populations to understand the value of spaces where this can occur. By mid-afternoon, the light over the city has taken on the particular quality of the Italian sun at an angle, warm and golden and slightly hazy with whatever is in the air, and the day has divided itself between what needed to be done in the morning and what will fill the evening, and you are in the gap between them, walking without particular urgency, letting the city carry you for a while. This is the Roman afternoon, the part that does not appear in the official histories or the political narratives, the part that is just time, belonging to whoever manages to carve it out of the daily requirements. You're walking past a wall on which someone has written something in paint, a political slogan supporting a candidate for a minor magistracy, and below it someone else has written a brief rude rebuttal, and below that someone has written a third thing that seems to be a non sequitur but which might be a joke if you knew the reference. The wall is several layers deep in paint at this point and has been so for years and will continue to be so. Rome writing itself on its own surfaces in the medium of whoever had a brush and something to say. The sun drops toward the hills beyond the city. The light changes again. The evening version of Rome is beginning to assemble itself, quieter in some ways than the day, more concentrated in its social arrangements, the public spaces giving way to the more private configurations of dinner and household and the smaller scale negotiations of the night. You climb your stairs as the last of the light disappears, and your building shifts into its nighttime register. The sounds of it different now, intimate rather than commercial, the sounds of people existing rather than people transacting. You have eaten. You're tired in the straightforward way of a day that has been physically full. The city outside continues in its nighttime version, the carts beginning to roll again as the daytime prohibition ends, the familiar sound of wheels on stone reasserting itself as the night's soundtrack. You close your eyes and listen to it for a moment. The sound of Rome continuing without you, as it always does, as it will again tomorrow, unchanged by your participation and uninterested in your departure. The city does not need you to witness it. It continues anyway, but you have witnessed it, and tomorrow you will witness it again. There is also the matter of Roman commerce at street level, which is worth inhabiting more fully than the passing observation of a thermopolium on a corner allows. The commercial life of Rome was not organised in the way that modern retail commerce is organised, with fixed stores in fixed locations selling fixed categories of goods in a predictable arrangement. It was layered, overlapping, constantly mobile, and densely concentrated in the spaces where people naturally gathered. The forums, particularly the Forum Romanum and the later imperial fora built by Augustus and Trajan, were commercial spaces as well as civic ones. The Trajan's Market, which was effectively an enormous multi-storey shopping complex built into the hillside adjacent to Trajan's Forum, is one of the best preserved examples of purpose-built retail space from the ancient world, and walking through its remains makes clear that the Romans understood, with considerable sophistication, the relationship between architecture and commercial activity. Put covered walkways where people naturally move, create spaces of varying sizes for different kinds of trade, bring everything together in a single destination that becomes itself an attraction. This is not so different from the logic of a modern shopping centre, and that continuity is not coincidental. The street vendors of Rome were ubiquitous and diverse. A man who had a good corner and a consistent product could make a living in the foot traffic of a major street without any fixed premises at all. He might sell small cakes, or sausages, or simple clay lamps or writing materials, or any of the dozens of small items that city life created continuous demand for. Women sold food from baskets, children ran errands for coin. The streets were an economic environment as much as a transportation corridor, every inch of good foot traffic representing potential commercial opportunity, and the Romans used them accordingly. The fuller's shops, the tabernae fuloniae, are one of the more distinctive elements of Roman street-level commercial life, partly because of their smell, and partly because of what their existence reveals about Roman urban economy. Fulling was the process by which wool cloth was cleaned and processed, and the primary cleaning agent used was urine, both human and animal, which was rich in ammonia and effective at removing grease and dirt from wool fibres. Fullers collected urine in large clay pots placed in the streets, which passers-by were welcome to use, and the pots were emptied regularly, and the contents used in the processing vats. This arrangement was common enough that the Emperor Vespasian, in a famous moment of sardonic Roman humour, placed a tax on the urine trade, which produced the saying attributed to him when his son objected to the undignified source of revenue: "Money does not smell." The fulleries were also bleaching establishments, using sulphur compounds to whiten wool cloth that customers brought in, and they did laundry in addition to processing new cloth. They were embedded in every neighbourhood, their distinctive smell announcing them from a distance, their vats and treading floors and rinsing areas occupying ground floor spaces that in other streets would be used for other shops. The fuller's shop is the Roman equivalent of a modern laundromat combined with a dry cleaner combined with a textile processor, all in one smelly ground floor unit, and the fact that every Roman neighbourhood had at least one tells you a great deal about the practical requirements of urban life at scale. The relationship between citizens and slaves in the public streets of Rome was omnipresent and essentially impossible to avoid, because the slave population of the city was enormous. Estimates of the slave population of Rome in the imperial period vary, but figures of between 300,000 and 400,000 have been suggested, in a total city population of perhaps 800,000 to 1 million, which would represent somewhere between a third and a half of the total population. These were not all household slaves or agricultural slaves working on rural estates. A significant number were urban slaves engaged in the full range of commercial, service, and skilled labour that kept the city functioning, working in shops and workshops and on construction sites, and in the households of everyone from modest craftsmen to the imperial family. Slaves walked in the same streets, used the same fountains, ate at the same thermopolia, bathed in the same facilities. The visual differentiation between slave and free person was not always obvious in the street, which was itself a source of anxiety for some Romans who wanted the boundary to be more visible. There had been proposals at various points in Roman history to introduce distinctive clothing for slaves so that they could be immediately identified as such, and these proposals had been rejected on the grounds that if slaves could see how many of them there were relative to their owners, the realization might prompt dangerous thoughts. The invisibility of the distinction was maintained not because Rome was comfortable with ambiguity, but because the alternative seemed worse. The Roman calendar itself structured daily life in ways that created a rhythm the city dweller moved inside without necessarily thinking about consciously. The Romans divided the year into a sequence of days that were officially classified as either dies fasti, days on which legal and public business could be conducted, or dies nefasti, days on which such business was prohibited, typically for religious reasons. Superimposed on this was the nundinal cycle, a recurring market day that fell every 8 days in the Roman counting, functioning as the commercial heartbeat of the city and the surrounding region, the day on which farmers from the countryside brought their produce to sell, and urban residents stocked up on what they needed for the following days. The nundinae were also occasions for social gathering. for the movement of people into the city from the farms and estates of the surrounding territory, for a temporary expansion of the city's commercial and social density. You knew the nundinal days the way you knew the weather patterns, as a background structure that organised time without being explicitly articulated. The religious calendar added another layer of structured time. Rome had a great number of festivals spread through the year, each one associated with specific deities and specific ritual requirements, and often specific public events. The Ludi Romani in September, the Ludi Megalenses in April, the Saturnalia in December, the Floralia in late April and early May, each one bringing its own character to the city's public life for the duration, its own particular mix of religious observance and secular entertainment and social license. The Saturnalia is perhaps the most famous to modern observers because of its reputation for social inversion, during which slaves were served by their masters at a formal dinner, and the normal hierarchies were temporarily suspended in a ritual acknowledgement of their arbitrariness. Whether the Saturnalia was experienced as genuinely liberating by the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy, or as a carefully managed pressure release that ultimately served to reinforce the existing order by providing a defined outlet for its tensions, is a question historians have argued about productively. The answer is probably both, which is usually the most accurate answer to questions about the social function of rituals that seem to contradict the norms they are embedded in. The Roman relationship with time itself was different from modern experience in ways that affected everything. There were no clocks as we understand them. Time was measured by sundials during the day and by water clocks at night, and the division of the day was not into equal hours but into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, which meant that a daytime hour in summer was considerably longer than a daytime hour in winter. This flexible relationship with measured time meant that appointments and schedules operated on different terms than modern equivalents, with a built-in fuzziness around timing that was simply accepted as the nature of the situation. When you arranged to meet someone at the third hour, you were communicating a general region of the morning rather than a precise point on a timeline. Roman life ran on approximate time, calibrated by the position of the sun, the sound of various regular events, and the accumulated sense of the city's daily rhythms that any experienced urban resident developed over years of living inside it. The night version of Rome, which officially began when the daytime prohibition on wheeled vehicles lifted, was a different city in the way that all cities are different after dark, the official structures relaxing somewhat, different categories of activity becoming possible, the population shifting in its composition as those whose lives were structured by daylight withdrew and those whose activities suited the night came forward. The street crime that worried respectable Romans concentrated in the nighttime hours, and walking alone after dark in the poorer neighbourhoods was understood to be a risk that most people managed by simply not doing it. The wealthy were accompanied by slaves who carried torches and whose physical presence represented a degree of protection. The less wealthy made their calculations and managed accordingly, choosing routes and timing based on what they knew of local conditions, or staying where they were and letting the night pass. The sounds of Rome at night were the sounds of its working infrastructure, the carts and wagons that came to life as the vehicle prohibition lifted, the loading and unloading at the docks along the Tiber, the movement of goods through streets that had been too crowded for such movement during the day. The Tiber docks were a major commercial hub, the point at which goods arriving by ship from Ostia, Rome's port at the mouth of the river, were transferred to smaller river vessels and brought up to the city, and the activity there continued around the clock in the way that major commercial ports always do, organised around the tides and the shipping schedules rather than the sun. The smell of the river was strongest at night when the breezes that carried it shifted. The sound of water was more audible when the daytime noise dropped, the Tiber moving past the city with a constancy that had been the background of Roman life for so long it had become genuinely invisible, noticed only in moments of unusual quiet. What the Romans built beyond the roads and the aqueducts and the amphitheatres and the legal systems and the administrative structures was something harder to name, a particular texture of urban experience, a way of organising a city that produced a specific quality of collective life. The density and the noise and the commercial activity and the public spaces and the social rituals of the bath and the forum and the games all combined into something that was genuinely unprecedented in the ancient world, a form of life that required new institutions to sustain it, and that produced, as a side effect of sustaining it, forms of human organisation and experience that had not existed before. The insular apartment building, the street-level thermopolium, the public bath complex, the nomenclator, the gladiatorial industry. These are all solutions to problems that only exist when you put 1 million people together in one place, and they are all characteristically Roman solutions, pragmatic and often uncomfortable and occasionally brilliant, produced by a civilization that was making up the answers to genuinely new questions as it went. You carry all of this with you when you climb your stairs at the end of the Roman day, when you sit on your mattress in the single room that is your particular portion of the vast collective enterprise of Roman urban life. The city is below you, and around you, and above you. Its sounds moving through the walls, its smells present in the air even when the window is closed, its social machinery continuing to operate in all directions regardless of what hour it is or what you're doing. You're one node in an enormous network, one consciousness among perhaps 1 million operating simultaneously within the boundaries of this city, and most of those other consciousnesses are doing the same thing you're doing right now, existing inside a system that is too large and too complex to comprehend all at once, navigating it day by day, learning its rhythms and its rules and its particular ways of rewarding attention and punishing inattention. This is what Rome actually was, before the marble hardened into monument, before the living city became the historical one. It was people, enormous numbers of them, doing the continuous work of being alive in a place that was itself continuously being made by the fact of their being there. Nothing more than this. Nothing less than this. Not everyone who lived by the knowledge of substances did so openly. In the Rome of the emperors, where power changed hands through assassination as often as through law, there was a particular kind of professional who existed in the shadows of the imperial household, consulted quietly and paid well, and never under any circumstances publicly acknowledged. She was not a physician, though her knowledge of plants and bodies rivaled any physician of her time. She was not a soldier, though the deaths she arranged altered the course of empires. She was a poisoner, and the most accomplished, the most celebrated, and in the coldest possible way the most respected practitioner of that particular art in all of Rome was a woman named Locusta. Her origins are obscure in the way that the origins of genuinely dangerous people often are, smoothed away by time and the preference of later historians for focusing on those who used her rather than on the woman herself. She came from Gaul, the broad region that corresponds roughly to modern France, which was Roman territory but not Rome, and she arrived in the city carrying knowledge she had accumulated over years of what can only be called systematic study. The Romans, despite their generally dismissive attitude toward women in formal intellectual roles, were pragmatic enough to recognize expertise when they encountered it, particularly when that expertise was useful to people who had enemies and were tired of waiting for those enemies to die of natural causes. She was, before she became Nero's instrument, apparently a criminal. This is the part that tends to be glossed over in accounts that focus on her later, imperial associations, but the historical record is fairly clear that Locusta was arrested and imprisoned at some point during the reign of Claudius, charged with poisoning. The charge was not, in itself, unusual. Accusations of poisoning were common in Rome, where the fear of being poisoned was so prevalent that wealthy households employed food tasters as a standard precaution, and where the line between herbal medicine and herbal murder was sufficiently blurry to generate considerable legal activity. What made Locusta unusual was not that she was charged, but what happened after. Claudius died in the year 54, and the circumstances of his death have been a matter of enthusiastic speculation ever since. The most widely repeated version of events holds that he was poisoned at dinner, and that the agent of this poisoning was mushrooms, specifically a preparation of mushrooms that had been very carefully and deliberately altered from their natural state. Whether Locusta was involved in the preparation of those mushrooms is something the ancient sources suggest without quite confirming, because the ancient sources were written by people who had their own reasons for presenting the story in various ways. What is clear is that after Claudius died, a woman with expertise in poisons found herself not executed but employed, which tells you a great deal about the priorities of those who came to power in his wake. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Nero was 17 when he became emperor, which is old enough to understand the mechanics of power and young enough to be frightened by the thought of losing it. His mother Agrippina the Younger had spent years maneuvering to place him on the throne, had likely arranged or facilitated the death of Claudius to make it happen, and was not at all shy about her expectation that her influence would continue once her son was in place. The early months of Nero's reign were shaped by this tension between a young man who wanted to rule and a formidable woman who believed she already did. Into this situation came Britannicus, the son of Claudius by an earlier marriage, the legitimate heir who had been passed over, who was growing older every day, and who represented a potential rival around whom dissatisfied elements of the court might eventually organise. Locusta solved this problem. Or more precisely, Nero asked Locusta to solve this problem, and she did, which is how the relationship between an emperor and his poisoner actually worked. The preparation she produced for use against Britannicus was apparently tested first, a kind of quality control that speaks to the seriousness with which this particular professional took her work. The initial test produced results that were deemed insufficiently reliable, too slow, not certain enough in its outcome. She revised her preparation. The second version was adjudged satisfactory. Britannicus died at a dinner party, in public, in front of witnesses, and in a way that was rapid enough that the official explanation, a childhood seizure disorder, was accepted by enough people that there was no immediate crisis, which was itself a kind of professional achievement. Nero, satisfied, kept her close. What followed was a period in which Locusta functioned as something that Rome did not have a formal title for, but which in practice amounted to a state poisoner. She had students, historical sources mention this explicitly. She taught what she knew to others, which means she was not just a practitioner but something approaching an instructor in a discipline that had no official curriculum and no authorized school. This was not knowledge that was written down in scrolls shelved in the great libraries. It lived in practice, in observation, in the careful accumulation of experience about what different substances did to different bodies at different quantities. She had that knowledge. She passed it on. The fact that she was permitted to do this, that the emperor who employed her allowed her to train others in the same skills she used on his behalf, suggests a certain pragmatic recognition that this was useful work that required expertise and sustained cultivation, and could not simply be improvised. The relationship between Locusta and Nero continued for years, through a reign that became progressively more erratic and more dangerous. Nero's rule, which began with enough promise that later commentators would describe his early years somewhat favourably, became over time a thing of sustained terror for the senatorial class, for anyone who accumulated too much influence or wealth or popularity, for the Christians in Rome who became convenient scapegoats after the Great Fire, and for anyone in his immediate circle who gave him reason to feel threatened. In this environment, a woman who could arrange a convincing death was not a convenience, but a necessity, and Locusta appears to have remained in good standing for a remarkably long time. The nature of her expertise was particular and accumulated. Roman poisoners, to the extent that we can reconstruct their practice from what ancient sources say about it, worked primarily with plant-derived substances, many of which were known in medicine, as well as in what we might call the opposite of medicine, hemlock, which the Greeks had used ceremonially in state-sanctioned executions, and which Socrates had made famous by drinking it, with apparent philosophical equanimity. Aconite, the plant known variously as monkshood or wolfsbane, which affects the heart in ways that can be made to look like natural cardiac failure. Substances derived from the deadly nightshade family, which were well known in the ancient world for their effects on breathing and vision. The line between these substances used therapeutically in small doses and deployed lethally in larger ones was exactly the kind of line that someone with Locusta's particular interest and attention would spend years studying. Dosage was everything. The preparation mattered. The delivery mechanism mattered. Getting all of these things right simultaneously, reliably, without aromatic or visual detection, under conditions where the target might be surrounded by cautious people with their own precautions, was a genuinely demanding technical problem. She would have known this. It was her profession. The callousness of what she did is real, and should not be minimized. People died because of what she prepared. People died because an emperor decided they were inconvenient, and then delegated the solution to her, and she provided the solution with apparent professional competence, and without, as far as the record shows, moral crisis. But the conditions that created her are worth sitting with. She lived in a system where power was maintained through violence, where the alternative to being useful was being disposable, where the skills she had could either make her wealthy and protected or get her executed, and she had clearly made a decision about which of those outcomes she preferred. The decision she made was pragmatic rather than admirable. It was also, in its particular Roman context, rational, and that is not a comfortable thing to notice. Nero's end came in 68, when the military finally turned against him and he fled and then died, either by his own hand or with assistance. Sources differ on this point, with the enthusiasm they tend to reserve for details that make good storytelling. With his patron gone, Locusta's position changed immediately. The emperors who followed in the chaotic year after Nero's death had no particular use for her, and she was tried and executed, the charges presumably covering the same activities she had been performing under imperial authorization for years. The shift is instructive. The same work that made her valuable to one regime made her prosecutable to the next. Power had protected her entirely until the moment it did not, and then it did not at all. What she left behind was not a named school or a recognized tradition. It was a knowledge, distributed among the students she had taught, woven into the fabric of Roman household management and imperial paranoia and the specific, terrible expertise of people who understood that in a world without reliable political security, the ability to arrange a death convincingly was a form of power that transcended the usual categories. Locusta was not the first poisoner in Roman history, and she was not the last, but she was the one whose name survived, the one whose relationship to imperial power was explicit enough to be recorded, the one who makes visible something about Rome that Rome was usually better at hiding. The empire was not built only by generals and senators and engineers. It was maintained year by year by people whose contributions were never spoken of publicly, whose skills were used and then denied, whose usefulness lasted precisely as long as it served someone else's purposes. She was one of those people. She knew it. She worked within it. And for a time, it was enough. The question of how Locusta actually acquired her knowledge is one that the ancient sources do not address in any detail, which is characteristic of how Rome treated expertise that it considered either too specialized or too uncomfortable to discuss directly. We know she came from Gaul, and Gaul in the Roman period was a territory with its own substantial tradition of plant knowledge, of herbalism and druids, and the careful, accumulated understanding of what the natural world contained and what its contents could do. Whether she learned from a specific tradition or teacher, whether she arrived in Rome with knowledge already formed or developed it after arriving, whether she worked alone or as part of a community of practice that the sources simply do not describe, we cannot say. What we can observe is the outcome. A woman in Rome whose knowledge of toxic substances was specific enough and reliable enough that the most powerful people in the world paid for access to it. That level of expertise does not arrive by accident. It is built through years of systematic attention. The Rome she moved through was itself deeply familiar with poison as a social and political fact. The Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficis, a law against assassins and poisoners, had been on the books since the time of Sulla in the 1st century before the Common Era, which tells you that the problem was real enough and widespread enough to require legislation. Roman households employed food tasters as a standard precaution among those who could afford them, and the fear of being poisoned was woven into the texture of elite Roman life in a way that was not paranoia but reasonable response to actual conditions. Emperors were particularly cautious. Claudius, who may have died from poisoning and who may have been among Locusta's earliest known victims, was by several accounts extremely careful about what he ate and drank, and the fact that someone managed to poison him anyway, if that is what happened, speaks to the sophistication of the method employed. The mushroom story is the one that sticks, partly because mushrooms are genuinely excellent vehicles for poison, partly because the story has a satisfying specificity. Claudius was known to be fond of mushrooms, the kind of detail that an observant person with knowledge of toxic substances and access to the imperial household would find useful. Amanita phalloides, the death cap, is among the most lethal fungi known and is difficult to distinguish from edible varieties when young. But the sophistication of the preparation attributed to Locusta goes beyond simply substituting a deadly mushroom for an edible one. The account suggests something more targeted, more controlled, a preparation that could be added to something already being served rather than substituted for it, which implies not just knowledge of what was toxic, but knowledge of how to extract, concentrate and deploy the relevant compounds in a way that the target could not detect and the serving staff would not intercept. This is a level of technical sophistication that takes time to develop. It is not something improvised, it is something built. Nero's use of her extended beyond the death of Britannicus. The ancient sources mention her in connection with at least one other imperial death, and she appears to have been consulted or employed in various contexts throughout the early part of Nero's reign. The relationship between them was not one of equals. She was a professional providing a service to a client who was also the most powerful man in the world, which is a particular kind of power dynamic with particular implications, but it was also not purely passive. She had expertise he needed. That expertise made her, within the specific terms of their arrangement, indispensable. Indispensable people in Roman imperial politics were not safe exactly, but they were not expendable in the same immediate way that people without unique value were. Her continued existence and freedom during the years of Nero's reign represented a calculation on his part that keeping her available was worth the risks that came with keeping someone who knew what she knew alive and in the city. The school she ran is one of the most remarkable aspects of her career, because it suggests that what she understood herself to be doing was not simply performing a service, but transmitting a discipline. Teaching implies that the knowledge is organized, that it can be communicated systematically, that there is a structure to it that a student can acquire and build on. Whatever the content of that teaching was, which the sources do not describe in any pedagogical detail, its existence confirms that what Locusta had was not simply talent or intuition, but organized knowledge, knowledge that had been accumulated and structured, and that she understood well enough to communicate to others. The Roman state was, by permitting this and benefiting from it, implicitly recognizing a form of expertise that it could not officially acknowledge without considerable awkwardness. The law against poisoners remained on the books while the emperor kept a poisoner on retainer. Rome was frequently capable of holding contradictions like this without apparent discomfort, operating in the space between official principle and practical necessity, with a pragmatism that could be mistaken for cynicism, but which was more accurately simply Roman. Her execution after Nero's fall was fast and probably intended to be symbolic as much as punitive. The new regime needed to demonstrate that the abuses of the previous one were being addressed, and Locusta was an unusually concrete symbol of those abuses, a person whose existence and official function under Nero encapsulated the corruption and violence of his court in a form that required no explanation. She was tried, she was convicted, she was executed. The accounts of her execution are brief and not particularly detailed, because by the time writers like Suetonius were describing it, she had been dead for decades, and the interest was in what she represented rather than in the specifics of what happened to her. She had been useful to power. Power had changed. She was no longer useful. The logic was entirely consistent. What Locusta represents in the larger context of Roman women and power is worth considering before we move on. Women in Rome operated under significant legal constraints. They could not hold magistracies, or vote, or serve in the military, or hold formal political office. Their public roles were defined and limited by law and custom in ways that restricted them to specific domains: the household, religious life, and the patronage networks of elite women, which were real and significant but operated through influence rather than formal authority. Locusta's career existed entirely outside these categories. She had neither a formal role nor a protected status. She had expertise, and her expertise was of a kind so specific and so needed that it created its own space, outside the official categories, in the margins of institutional Rome where things happened that Rome acknowledged in practice and denied in principle. In this way, she is a window into a kind of female power that Rome did not name and did not celebrate, but which it used, repeatedly without apology. She was not the only Roman woman who operated in these margins. Rome's history is full of women whose influence was exercised through unconventional means, through knowledge, through connection, through the accumulation of information in spaces where they were underestimated. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, was in many ways the architect of his rise and was eventually murdered by him, which is its own kind of Roman story. Livia, Augustus's wife, was the subject of accusations of poison in her own time, and has been accused by later writers of a level of behind-the-scenes manipulation that, if accurate, would make her one of the most consequential figures in early imperial history. Whether the accusations were fair in individual cases is less important than what their persistence reveals: that Roman culture understood that women in proximity to power could, and did, exercise forms of influence that were not sanctioned, not visible, and not easily controlled. Locusta was the extreme case of this tendency, the woman whose unofficial influence operated through the most extreme means available. Her career was aberrant in its specifics, but not in its underlying structure. Women found ways to have power in Rome. The ways were often oblique. Locusta's way was simply more consequential than most. The imperial household into which Locusta moved was a world with its own internal logic, its own power structures, its own vocabulary of favour and disfavour, and its own particular relationship to violence. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, from Augustus through Nero, produced a sequence of reigns that were, from the perspective of those inside the court, a sustained exercise in survival under conditions of acute unpredictability. Emperors who felt threatened, and they all felt threatened because the position generated real threats as well as imagined ones, responded by eliminating sources of threat, which meant that proximity to imperial power was both the most desirable and the most dangerous position available in Roman society. The men and women who surrounded the emperor were playing a game with extremely high stakes, and in which the rules changed based on the emperor's current anxieties, which changed constantly and were not always communicated in advance. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, is in many ways the most illuminating figure for understanding the court environment in which Locusta operated, because Agrippina was herself one of the most calculating political actors of the period, and because her trajectory, from the most powerful woman in Rome to a woman murdered by her own son, illustrates exactly the conditions under which everyone in the imperial court was operating. She had manoeuvred for years to place Nero on the throne, had managed the relationship with Claudius to advance her son's position, had likely facilitated Claudius's death, and had then discovered that the son she'd worked so hard to position was unwilling to remain the instrument of his mother's ambitions. The shift in their relationship from collaboration to conflict to the final murderous rupture is a compressed version of the dynamic that characterized the Julio-Claudian court throughout its history. The intense concentration of power in a single person who was simultaneously surrounded by people competing to influence that power, and the violence that resulted when those competitions resolved unfavourably. In this environment, someone with Locusta's skill set was genuinely useful, in a way that skill sets with more legitimate applications were not. A general could be replaced, a lawyer could be replaced, a physician could be replaced because there were other physicians, but a poisoner of demonstrated reliability, someone who had already shown that her preparations worked under actual operating conditions on actual targets of political significance, was not easily replaced. There was no training program for this, no recognized school, no guild of poisoners with apprentices available for hire. There was only the specific, accumulated, tested expertise of a particular individual, and that individual was Locusta. This is the economic logic of her position distilled to its most basic form. She had something unique, something proven, something that the person at the centre of Roman power needed and could not easily obtain elsewhere. That gave her value. Value in the Roman imperial court was the only reliable form of protection available. The experience of being Nero's poisoner, which is to say being a person whose specialised skill is deployed at the direction of someone who faces no meaningful consequences for anything he does, would have had its own psychological texture. She was not making decisions, she was executing them, providing the technical implementation for choices that had been made elsewhere. The moral responsibility, in Roman terms as in many subsequent frameworks, was with the one who ordered the action rather than the one who carried it out. Whether this logic was actually psychologically effective, whether it provided genuine relief from what she knew she was doing, is something we cannot know. What we know is that she continued to operate, which suggests that either the logic worked for her, or she had found some other way to sustain her activity, and that in the context of a Roman world in which the violence of power was visible and constant and experienced by everyone in the city as simply the texture of life under an emperor, the particular violence of her work may have felt less exceptional than it would feel from any position outside that context. Now consider what it would mean to carry someone else's social world inside your head. Not your own connections, not your own relationships, not the network of people you have built through the ordinary accumulation of a life. Someone else's, every face, every name, every political affiliation, family connection, debt owed and debt outstanding, grudge held and favour expected. The entire social architecture of a powerful Roman man's public existence, compressed into a single human memory that you are required to access instantly, accurately, and on demand in any setting, at any hour, under any level of social pressure, without ever making a mistake that you would not immediately regret. This was your life as a nomenclator. You wake up already running the list, not literally, not consciously, but the names are always there in the shallower layers of your sleep, waiting. You have been a nomenclator long enough that the list has become part of your resting mind, the way musicians hear music constantly without trying, or the way someone who has spent years at sea can feel the sway of water long after they are on land. The names of hundreds of Roman citizens live in you now, organised not alphabetically, but the way memory actually works, in webs of association, where one face pulls up another, where a name arrives attached to its family and its history, and its current political standing all at once. You are a human database in a city that runs on social memory, and you are the property of a man who cannot afford to forget anyone's name. Your Dominus is a senator, or he was, or he is working toward being one again. The exact status shifts with the political weather, but the basic situation is constant. He is a man of ambition and consequence, a man who needs to be seen and known and respected by the right people, and who has enough enemies that he cannot afford to accidentally slight an ally by failing to recognize him in public. In Rome, failing to recognize someone who expects to be recognized is not a minor social awkwardness. It is an insult. It implies that the person is not important enough to remember, which in a society built on hierarchies of status and honor is a genuine wound. The senator cannot know everyone by sight. No one can know everyone in a city of hundreds of thousands, but he can have you, and you know everyone. The morning begins with preparation. Not your preparation, his. While he completes his own morning rituals, you stand nearby and review what the day holds, cycling through the faces you will likely encounter, refreshing the web of associations attached to each one. The salutatio happens first, the morning greeting ritual in which clients come to the house of their patron to demonstrate their loyalty and be seen doing so. This happens every morning that the senator is receiving, which is most mornings, and the clients arrive in a queue that can stretch out into the street and down the block, each one waiting his turn to be greeted, to say a few words, to be acknowledged. Your job during the salutatio is to stand at the senator's left shoulder, close enough to whisper, and to provide the name and key social information of each approaching client before the senator has to demonstrate that he knows it himself. You see a man approaching and your memory produces him immediately, not with effort but with the practiced automaticity of something that has been trained until it runs without thinking. His name, his father's name, his tribe and voting district, whether he is a creditor or debtor in his relationship with the senator, the last favour he asked for and whether it was granted, the family matter that came up the last time they spoke, the fact that his daughter recently married someone whose family has a connection to a political faction that the senator is currently cultivating. You whisper this in a compressed, efficient string, just enough, not so much that the senator looks overwhelmed, exactly the right quantity of social information to allow a greeting that feels warm and specific and personal. The client's face changes slightly as the senator calls his name and references something particular, as it always does. He is pleased. He feels seen. The relationship is reinforced. You have done your job. You do this for every client who comes through. Some of them you know extremely well because they are regulars, faces you have seen hundreds of times, whose family trees you could recite in your sleep because you practically do. Others are newer, people who have recently attached themselves to the senator's patronage network, whose details you have had to learn quickly from whatever information you could gather. A few are people who came once or twice and then became irregular, faces that require a slightly longer pull from deeper in your memory, and those are the moments you are most careful, most focused, because the information must be right. An error here is not a private matter. An error happens in public, in front of the client, in front of other clients, in front of whatever slaves and household members are nearby. An error makes the senator look careless and inattentive, which makes him look less powerful, which is, in the logic of Roman social performance, genuinely damaging. And it is your error. The consequences of it land on you. The afternoon takes you out into the city. This is the part of the role that is most demanding and least forgiving. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The morning salutatio is controlled. You know who is coming because clients have arranged to come. The street is different. On the street, encounters happen without announcement, without preparation, without any warning at all. A face appears from a crowd, and you have seconds, sometimes less, to identify it, locate the relevant information, and get it to the senator before he has to speak. You walk at his left shoulder always, close enough to be heard in a whisper, far enough not to be intrusive. You're watching every face in the direction he is moving, scanning continuously, filtering the hundreds of people you can see at any moment against the library inside your head, always asking the same silent question. Is this someone who matters? And if so, who? Most people you see are not in the library. They are just Romans, just the city's population moving through its streets, and they do not require your attention. But the ones who are, the ones who appear from the crowd with the posture and bearing of people of consequence, senators and knights and wealthy merchants and their family members, allies and rivals and the clients of rivals, they require your full and immediate attention, and the city produces them continuously, without schedule, from any direction. You've been doing this long enough that the scan has become something below conscious thought, a continuous background process, and when it identifies something it surfaces it immediately, without being asked. A face resolves itself into a name and a set of associations before you have fully decided to look at it. This is what extensive practice does to memory. It makes it automatic, and automatic is what you need because there is no time for anything else. The Forum is the most demanding space in the city for a nomenclator, because it is the place where the senator is most likely to encounter the widest variety of significant people in the least predictable sequence. He goes there to be seen, to conduct business, to engage in the continuous performance of relevance that Roman political life requires. The Forum on a busy afternoon is a social environment of considerable density, and you are inside it reading it constantly, identifying, categorizing, prioritizing, determining which approaching figure needs immediate attention and which can be allowed to pass without intervention, and all of this while keeping your own physical position close enough to be useful without being visible enough to seem odd or intrusive. You're supposed to be almost invisible. The art is in the invisibility. The senator looks like a man who simply knows everyone. You are the reason he looks that way, and you're standing at his left shoulder, and no one is thinking about you at all. This is correct. This is exactly what it is supposed to look like. The mistakes you make are not always your fault, but fault is not really the relevant category here. If you give a wrong name, it does not matter why you gave it. If you miss someone who should have been recognized, it does not matter that the crowd was dense or the light was poor, or the man had changed his appearance since you last saw him. What matters is the outcome. The senator was embarrassed, or the client was slighted, or an opportunity for reinforcing an alliance was missed, and those consequences trace back to the information you provided, which traces back to you. Roman household discipline is not abstract. It is physical and immediate, and you know this in your body in the particular way that people know things when the consequences of error have been applied to them directly. You are careful. You're extremely careful. You think of careful as the baseline condition of your existence, not an achievement, but the minimum necessary state. The social geography of Rome is also constantly shifting, which means your library must shift with it. People die and new people inherit their social positions. Political fortunes change and an ally becomes someone to avoid, and a rival becomes someone to cultivate. A man who was powerful last year is prosecuted this year, and his name is now a liability. A woman who married into a connected family 3 months ago now has a husband whose opinion matters in ways it did not before. You must track all of this continuously, updating the library in real time based on what you observe and hear, always keeping it current, always knowing that outdated information is almost as dangerous as no information. You gather what you can from the morning conversations during the salutatio, from the senator's own remarks, from the household staff who move through the city on errands, and return with the ambient information that the city's social activity continuously produces. There are evenings, formal dinners at which the senator hosts significant guests, or at which he and his household attend as guests at another man's table. These evenings require a different application of your skill. At dinner, the environment is slower and the encounters are more sustained, which means the pressure of split-second identification is somewhat reduced, but the depth of information required is considerably increased. A guest at dinner will actually converse with the senator, will spend an hour or more in conversation, and that conversation will touch on people and events and relationships, and the senator will need to respond in ways that demonstrate genuine familiarity and engagement. You are there, nearby, and when there is a moment, a pause between courses, a brief separation between guests, you can provide additional information, the context that makes the conversation seem not just polite, but genuinely informed. At dinner, a good nomenclator contributes to the quality of the senator's conversation without the conversation ever revealing that there is a contribution being made. The dinner appears to be between the senator and his guests. It is also, quietly and invisibly, between you and the social world you carry inside your head. What does this life do to you over time? It does something. You have become a particular kind of person, someone who processes social information constantly and automatically, someone for whom every public space is a scanning environment rather than simply a place to be. You notice things that other people do not notice. You see faces in the way that painters see colour, as primary data rather than background detail. You remember conversations not for their emotional content but for the social information they contain. People's names and their associations and their relationships are the texture of your experience, more than your own preferences or your own desires, more sometimes than your own history. You are the vessel of someone else's social world. You have become very good at it. Whether this is who you would have chosen to be, given the choosing, is a question you do not spend much time on. The list is there when you wake up. The day begins, the names are ready, names. What nobody tells you when you begin this work, what nobody could tell you because it is the kind of thing that only emerges from years of practice, is that memory of the kind you are required to maintain is not passive. It does not simply sit and wait to be accessed. It requires continuous maintenance, continuous attention, a kind of low-level engagement with the material that never fully stops. When you are walking through the forum, part of your mind is always doing a soft rehearsal, cycling through names and faces and associations, reinforcing the connections between them, filling in any gaps you have noticed. When you're in a quieter moment, serving at table or waiting outside while your dominus takes a meeting, you're reviewing, updating, checking the consistency of what you know against the new information you have gathered since your last review. The nomenclator, who has been in the work for years, is always, in some portion of his attention, running the list. This is not a burden exactly, it is simply what the work has made of him. The list is always there. It has become structural. The politics of the list are something you are always navigating. Not everyone on it has the same status, the same relationship to your dominus, or the same sensitivity. Some names are straightforward. Clients who have been loyal for years, allied families with whom the relationship is warm and uncomplicated, men of such established standing that mentioning them requires no delicacy whatsoever. Others are more complicated. A man who was an ally and is now in a slightly ambiguous position because of a recent political development. A family that your dominus owes a debt to and has not yet repaid. A situation that requires careful management when you encounter them in public. A former enemy with whom a tenuous reconciliation has been negotiated and who must therefore be greeted with exactly the right degree of warmth. Enough to signal that the reconciliation is real, not so much as to look performative or desperate. These gradations matter. Getting them wrong in the wrong direction is as bad as missing a name entirely, because Roman social life runs on calibration, and calibration depends on information being accurate at a level of granularity that most people do not think about until it fails. Your dominus trusts you to this extent, that he will adjust his approach to someone based on whatever you tell him in the moment before the encounter. This is a significant trust, and you are aware of it constantly. If you tell him someone is currently an ally when that person has in fact shifted allegiances, he will treat them accordingly, and the mismatch will eventually become apparent, and the embarrassment will be real, and the question of where the failure originated will be asked. You are the point at which information enters the system. If the information is wrong, the consequences trace back to you. This is not a position that invites complacency. It is a position that demands the continuous maintenance of certainty, or at least the appearance of it, which in practice means never giving him information you are not sure of, and finding ways to quietly fill gaps before they become visible. The ways you fill gaps are various. The household staff are a primary resource, the other slaves and freedmen who move through the city on their various tasks and who pick up ambient information about families and households and current social situations as a matter of course. You cultivate relationships within the household that give you access to this information, not by asking directly in ways that would make your intelligence gathering obvious, but by being the kind of person that other people in the household talk to, a good listener, a reliable presence, someone who can be told things. information flows to people who know how to receive it without making the giver feel exposed. You have learned to be that kind of person. It is part of the job. The physical experience of being a nomenclator is less dramatic than its social function, which means it is often uncomfortable in the unphotogenic way of all work that consists primarily of sustained attention and physical presence. You stand for hours, you walk for hours. You're perpetually at the left shoulder of a man whose pace you must match, regardless of what your own body would prefer. If he slows, you slow. If he accelerates, you accelerate. If he stops to talk, you stop and stand at the appropriate distance, close enough to be heard in a whisper, far enough not to be within the conversational space of the exchange itself. You have learned to distribute your weight between your feet in a way that allows long periods of standing without becoming visibly uncomfortable, because visible discomfort draws attention to you, and a nomenclator who draws attention is a nomenclator who is not doing his job correctly. The weather is what it is, which in Rome means hot in summer in a way that makes standing still in a toga feel like a form of mild punishment, and in winter means cold mornings that take a long time to warm up if they warm up at all. You are always appropriately dressed because appearing to be poorly equipped for the conditions would reflect on your dominus in the way that all visible failures of his household staff reflect on him. You manage. You make yourself comfortable within the constraints of the situation, finding shade when it exists, standing in the shelter of a building when the wind is bad, accepting the discomfort when neither is available, and moving past it with the practiced equanimity of someone for whom equanimity under uncomfortable conditions is itself a professional requirement. The evenings at dinner are in some ways the most intellectually demanding part of the work, because the conversations at Roman dinner parties were not simply social pleasantries. They were often genuinely substantive, philosophical and literary and political, conducted by men who had been educated extensively in rhetoric and classical texts, and who engaged with ideas with the same competitive energy they brought to everything else. Your dominus participates in these conversations, and your job during them is to ensure that when a name comes up, when a reference is made to a person or a family or a recent political development, he has the information he needs to respond with appropriate intelligence. This requires you to track the conversation, identify which references carry social information, and be ready to provide context in the moments when the flow of discussion creates an opening. There are evenings when a guest tells a story about someone, a mutual acquaintance perhaps, and your dominus needs to know enough about that someone to respond in a way that demonstrates genuine knowledge of the situation, without revealing that he has been briefed on it. The art here is in the seamlessness. The senator who knows everything seems like a man of wide connections and sharp attention. The senator who is visibly being fed information by his slave seems dependent and slightly ridiculous. Your dominus knows this. You know this. The entire transaction between you is premised on the maintenance of an illusion, which is that he simply knows. It is a collaborative performance between the man who needs to appear to know and the man who actually knows, and it only works if the collaboration is invisible. Some of what you know you could not share even if you wanted to. The names of people your dominus is trying to avoid for whatever reason, and the strategies for doing so without making the avoidance visible. The history behind certain grudges that informs how certain encounters must be handled. Information about your dominus himself that has come to you through the job, but which belongs to him in the sense that it was never meant for you and is not yours to use. You hold all of this the way you hold everything in the list. Systematically, without interpretation, available when needed and contained when it is not. A nomenclator who cannot keep confidence is a nomenclator who cannot be trusted, and a nomenclator who cannot be trusted is a former nomenclator, which in the conditions of Roman slave life is not a comfortable position to arrive at. Years pass and the list grows. It grows as the senator's network expands, as new families enter his orbit, as political changes bring new alliances and end old ones. It grows as you learn more of the city, as your own movement through Rome expands your direct observation of who is who and where they stand, and it grows heavier in a way that is not quite metaphorical. There is a weight to carrying the social world of another person inside your head, a kind of responsibility that does not diminish with familiarity but simply becomes different, more settled, a permanent feature of your mental landscape rather than an acute burden. You have been this person for long enough that you are not sure what you would be without it. The list is you now, as much as anything else is. You are the man who knows everyone, and in Rome, That is a particular kind of power, which is to say it is a kind of power that is entirely borrowed, entirely conditional, and entirely dependent on the survival and continued relevance of the man whose name is at the top of the list. When his fortunes change, yours change. When he rises, you rise with him. When he falls, the list you carry inside your head becomes a liability rather than an asset. This is the nomenclator's particular version of the Roman condition, significant and precarious at exactly the same time. The specific challenge of Roman naming conventions is something that every nomenclator had to master, at a level that goes beyond simply learning which name belonged to which face. Roman naming, particularly among the elite citizen classes, operated on a system that was simultaneously orderly in its structure and confusing in its practical output. A male Roman citizen of the Republic and early imperial period typically had 3 names: the praenomen, the given name, and the most personal, which was shared with a limited repertoire of about 18 names in common use, so limited that you would encounter multiple Marcuses and Quintuses and Gaiuses in any social gathering. The nomen, the family or clan name which identified his genes, and the cognomen, which was originally a nickname or descriptive addition that had over time become hereditary and served to distinguish branches within a large family. The result of this system was that in a gathering of Roman men of similar social class, you might have several people with the same praenomen, several with the same nomen, and a cognomen that was the main differentiator. A nomenclator who stored names primarily by their most distinctive element would be reasonably functional. One who memorized the full 3-name combination would be considerably more reliable, because knowing the full name allowed you to distinguish between men who otherwise shared 2 of their 3 names in common, which happened constantly. Women's naming was simpler in structure but not in consequence. A Roman woman of the citizen class was typically known by the feminine form of her father's nomen, so the daughter of a man named Marcus Tullius Cicero was simply Tullia, and the daughters of the Iuli were all Iulia. If there were multiple daughters, they might be distinguished by first and second, or elder and younger, which created its own set of disambiguation challenges. Women's names changed less through their lives than men's did, but their social positions changed constantly through marriage and the associated shifts in family allegiance, which meant that the nomenclator tracking a woman needed to maintain not just her name, but the current state of her family connections and the political valences that attached to them. The adoption practices of Roman elite families added another layer of complexity. When a Roman man was adopted by another family, he typically took the names of his adoptive father, while adding a modified form of his birth family name as an additional cognomen. This meant that a man's name was itself a compressed genealogical record, and reading it correctly required knowing enough Roman family history to decode the layers of origin and adoption that might be encoded in a single long name. The Emperor Augustus was born Gaius Octavius, was adopted by Julius Caesar in his will, became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and was eventually given the title Augustus by the Senate. Tracking the names of people connected to the imperial family who underwent these transformations regularly and whose names carried significant political information required the nomenclator to maintain not just a current snapshot of the social world but a historical record as well, because the history encoded in a name was often exactly the information that determined how an encounter should be managed. The work of a nomenclator also extended in the most elaborate households to tracking foreigners, ambassadors, merchants, and representatives of client kingdoms and conquered peoples whose names operated on entirely different systems and whose social positions required a different kind of contextual knowledge to manage correctly. A Parthian envoy had a name that followed Parthian conventions and a social position that required understanding what the current state of the Roman-Parthian relationship was and how that affected the appropriate tone of the greeting. An Egyptian merchant had a naming convention influenced by both Egyptian and Greek practice and a social position that was simultaneously potentially very wealthy and definitively not of citizen status, which required its own calibrated response. The nomenclator's library, in a sufficiently cosmopolitan household, was not just a Roman library. It was a library of the known world's social geography, kept current and accessible and deployed on demand in a city that was itself the meeting point of everything that world contained. Pull back now from the ground of Roman daily life, from the narrow street and the nomenclator's whispered intelligence, and look instead at the largest public spectacle the Roman world produced, the one that drew the biggest crowds, generated the most revenue, sustained the most passionate opinion, and has been misunderstood more consistently than almost any other institution Rome left behind. The gladiatorial games exist in the modern imagination primarily as a vision of savage, unregulated bloodlust, of men hurled into an arena to kill each other for the entertainment of crowds who had lost all capacity for empathy. This image is not entirely wrong, but it is missing almost everything that made the system actually function. What the gladiatorial games actually were, beneath the blood and the roar of the crowd, was a meticulously organised commercial and professional enterprise, one with management structures and medical staff and training systems and regulatory frameworks and career trajectories, and one that the Romans themselves understood to be considerably more complicated than its public face suggested. Begin with the official image, because the official image is genuinely powerful and not invented. The munera, which is the proper term for the gladiatorial events, were public spectacles funded by wealthy patrons or the state, held in amphitheatres of which the Colosseum is the most famous and largest but far from the only one, attended by tens or hundreds of thousands of Romans who treated them as a central feature of their civic and leisure calendar. The crowd was enormous, the stakes were high, the performance was often genuinely skilled and sometimes genuinely lethal, and the emotional investment of the Roman public was real and intense. Emperors used the games to demonstrate generosity and to manage public sentiment. Politicians who funded exceptional games enhanced their reputations in ways that translated directly into political capital. The games were also, explicitly and unambiguously, connected to Roman ideas about courage, endurance, the performance of virtue under pressure, and the willingness to face death with dignity. These were not incidental themes. They were the official moral architecture of the spectacle. But the official image sat on top of a very different operational reality. Let us start with the gladiators themselves, because the common assumption is that gladiators were slaves thrown into combat with no training, no rights, and no futures, dying in large numbers every time they entered the arena. The reality, carefully reconstructed from archaeological evidence, legal documents, graffiti, and the writings of Roman physicians, is considerably more interesting. Most gladiators were indeed either slaves or condemned criminals or prisoners of war, none of these categories suggesting a voluntary entry into the profession. But once inside the system, they entered an institution with real structures, real investments, and real interests in keeping them functional for as long as possible. The lanista was the owner and manager of a gladiatorial school, the ludus, and the lanista's entire business model depended on producing skilled gladiators who could perform convincingly over multiple engagements. Training a gladiator was expensive. It took time, professional instruction, consistent feeding, medical attention, and equipment. A gladiator who died in his first appearance after a year of training represented a significant financial loss. A gladiator who could perform compellingly across multiple appearances, who built a reputation and drew crowds specifically to see him, was an asset worth protecting. This does not mean gladiators were treated with kindness or genuine consideration as human beings. It means they were treated with the kind of pragmatic attention to physical condition that any expensive commercial asset receives. The distinction matters, but the practical consequences were real regardless of the motivation. Gladiators ate better than most Romans. This is documented in the skeletal remains from gladiatorial cemeteries, several of which have been found and analysed, most notably a well-preserved example from Ephesus in what is now Turkey. The analysis of these bones reveals a diet unusually high in plant-based carbohydrates, barley and beans being the main constituents, which gave rise to the Roman nickname for gladiators, hordeari or barley eaters. This diet was not a punishment or a deprivation, it was deliberate nutritional management. High carbohydrate intake builds a layer of subcutaneous fat over the muscles, which sounds counterintuitive until you understand what it does in combat. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A layer of fat over the muscles means that cuts and wounds to the surface of the body are less immediately incapacitating, that the muscle beneath is protected by an additional layer, that the fighter can sustain surface injuries and continue performing where a leaner man might be immediately disabled. The diet was engineering, It was the careful management of a body to optimize it for a particular kind of performance under a particular kind of stress. The medical care available to gladiators was also, by ancient standards, genuinely advanced. We know this in part because of one of the most important figures in the history of ancient medicine, a man named Galen, who before he became the most influential physician in the Roman world served as the doctor to the gladiators of Pergamon. Galen's years of treating gladiatorial injuries gave him a clinical experience with traumatic wounds that very few physicians in the ancient world could match, and the techniques he developed and refined during that period influenced medical practice for more than 1,000 years after his death. He treated fractures and dislocations and muscle tears and puncture wounds, and the particular injuries that result from bladed weapons used against trained opponents, and he did so systematically, with genuine interest in outcomes, because the men he was treating were expected to fight again, and the quality of his care affected whether that happened. The financial pressure that produced good gladiatorial medical care also, as a side effect, produced advances in surgical and trauma medicine that had implications far beyond the arena. The fights themselves were more regulated than the popular image suggests. There were referees, trained officials who stood in the arena and monitored the action, and intervened when the rules were not being followed. There were weight categories and specialization types. The different kinds of gladiator, the heavily armed secutor, the net-wielding retiarius, the shield-bearing mumio, the mounted equity, each type with its own defined equipment and fighting style, were not just aesthetic categories. They were a system designed to produce interesting and relatively balanced matchups, to ensure that the combat was skilled and engaging rather than simply a matter of size and brute force prevailing immediately. The specialization types were also, incidentally, very carefully developed in terms of their visual contrast. A gladiator, with almost no armor moving against one with heavy coverage, was visually dramatic and technically interesting in ways that match combat would not be. Someone thought carefully about what made this entertaining. The product was designed. The question of how often gladiators actually died in the arena is one where the popular image is most dramatically wrong. The cinematic version of the gladiatorial games has almost everyone dying almost all the time, with the arena as a kind of industrial death machine processing human beings at high speed. The actual evidence suggests something quite different. The death rate per fight, in the period for which we have reasonable documentation, appears to have been somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10, depending on the period and context, which is still horrific by any modern standard, but is dramatically different from the near-universal death rate the popular imagination assumes. The gladiator who lost a fight did not automatically die. He might raise his finger, a signal of submission, and the decision about whether he lived or died would be made by the presiding official, often the event's sponsor, sometimes the emperor, sometimes by the response of the crowd. The popular image of thumbs up or thumbs down is probably not accurate in its specifics. The gesture involved may have been different, but the general mechanism is real. The crowd participated in the decision. The loser might be spared, and in many cases sparing the loser was the better business decision, because a skilled and well-known gladiator who lost one fight and survived was still an asset, still had an audience, still had commercial value. The free gladiator is a complication that the simple slave combat narrative tends to omit. In the later Republic and into the imperial period, some gladiators were volunteers, free men who contracted with a lanista to enter the profession for a defined period in exchange for payment, housing, food, and medical care. The social stigma attached to gladiators, and there was real stigma, they were considered infames, people of degraded legal status, meant that volunteering was considered disreputable enough that the Roman sources tend to be judgmental about those who did it. But people did it anyway, sometimes in significant numbers, particularly in periods of economic stress when the guaranteed housing and feeding and the possibility of prize money represented a real improvement over available alternatives. The volunteer gladiator was making a rational economic calculation under constrained circumstances, which does not make the calculation comfortable, but which situates it in the real conditions of Roman life rather than in a simple story about barbarism and compulsion. What the crowd saw in the arena was not simply violence, it was shaped, categorized, regulated, and commercially managed violence, produced by an industry that had elaborate systems for training and maintaining its performers, that had medical staff whose expertise was unmatched in their era. that had regulatory frameworks and official rules and specialised personnel for managing the events, and that was embedded in a commercial structure where the economics of the business pushed consistently toward keeping gladiators alive and functional rather than dead and replaced. None of this makes the gladiatorial games acceptable by any ethical standard a modern person would apply. Men still died. Men were still property or condemned criminals or prisoners without meaningful choices. The crowd still cheered at the suffering of real human beings, and the emperors who funded the games were using human lives as a political tool without compunction or apology. But there is something worth understanding in the gap between what the games appeared to be and what they actually were, because that gap reveals something important about how Rome managed spectacle. The Romans were extraordinarily good at constructing public performances that appeared to be simple and immediate while being in fact carefully engineered. The games looked like chaos. They were machinery. They looked like pure appetite. They were calculation. They looked like the raw expression of Roman power and contempt for weakness. They were also, underneath that performance, a commercial operation run by people who needed their product to be sustainable, who had employees and investments and reputations and recurring events to schedule and fill. The arena was a stage, and the stage had been built with considerable care by people who understood what an audience wanted and had spent generations refining their ability to provide it. The blood was real, the engineering behind it was also real, and knowing both things is closer to understanding Rome than knowing only one. The specialization system within gladiatorial combat is worth examining in some detail, because it reveals how thoroughly the gladiatorial games had been developed as a product rather than simply a practice. There were somewhere between 15 and 20 recognized types of gladiator in the Roman period, depending on how you count and in which era, and each type came with precisely defined equipment, fighting style, and conventional opponent pairings. The retiarius fought with a weighted net, a trident and a dagger, almost no armour, heavily mobile and relying on speed and reach and the tangling ability of the net. His conventional opponent was the secutor, who wore a rounded helmet with small eye holes that reduced peripheral vision, and a large arm guard, heavily armoured by comparison, slower, committed to closing the distance quickly, because in a long-range fight the net and trident gave the retiarius a significant advantage. The visual contrast between these two fighters was dramatic, one nearly naked and mobile, the other armoured and relentless, and the tactical dynamic between their styles was genuinely interesting as combat, which was the point. Whoever designed the type system understood that the most entertaining match was not the one where the outcome was predetermined by obvious physical superiority, but the one where different approaches to the problem of defeating an opponent created genuine uncertainty about the outcome. The equipment itself was expensive and carefully maintained. Gladiatorial armour was not the field armour of Roman soldiers, utilitarian and designed for practicality in campaign conditions. It was theatrical armour, elaborately decorated, designed to look impressive in the arena, to catch the light and the attention of the crowd. The helmets in particular were often elaborately crested and decorated, completely impractical for anything but arena combat, their large visors and elaborate grills providing protection while creating an almost inhuman silhouette that the crowd found exciting. The weapons were real and sharp enough to kill, because the threat had to be real to generate the tension the event required, but they were also maintained by the ludus' staff and repaired and replaced as needed, because a broken weapon in the middle of a fight was a logistical failure that disrupted the event and embarrassed the management. Equipment maintenance was part of the gladiatorial operation. Someone's job was to keep the tridents sharp and the nets in good repair, and the helmets properly fitted and the arm guards functioning. This was skilled work and was treated as such. Training at a ludus was organised with military-like discipline and was conducted by professional trainers called doctores, who were typically themselves former gladiators of some accomplishment. The value of having a former practitioner teach the craft is obvious. Technique learned from someone who has actually used it in the arena under competitive pressure is different from technique learned from someone who has only theorized about it. The doctors were among the more senior and privileged members of the gladiatorial establishment, their expertise valuable and their experience scarce in a way that gave them a degree of status within the institution. A good trainer who could consistently produce skilled fighters was a commercial asset to the lanista, and lanista competed for them the way sports organizations compete for good coaches, by offering better terms and more authority than the competition. This is another detail that reveals how thoroughly the gladiatorial business ran on commercial logic. The crowds who watched the games were not a homogeneous mass of bloodthirsty spectators. They were, like the audiences of any large public entertainment, varied in their knowledge and their interests, and the kind of engagement they brought to what they were watching. The true connoisseurs of gladiatorial combat were those who understood the technical dimensions of what they were watching, who could recognize good footwork and poor defensive positioning, and the strategic implications of a particular tactical choice at a particular moment in a fight. These spectators were not simply watching men hurt each other. They were watching skilled practitioners of a specialized discipline perform under maximum pressure, and they had developed the analytical vocabulary to evaluate what they saw. Graffiti from Pompeii, which provides some of our most immediate windows into what ordinary Romans thought about things, includes detailed commentary on gladiatorial performances that reflects this kind of technical knowledge. Praise for specific techniques, criticism of poor performances, assessments of particular fighters' tactical tendencies and weaknesses that sound less like cheering for a favourite and more like commentary from someone who knows what good fighting looks like. The political dimension of the games was explicit and understood by everyone. An emperor or magistrate who funded spectacular games with large numbers of combatants and high-quality fighters and interesting exotic elements, a particularly unusual pairing of types or a beast hunt of impressive scale, was making a statement about his wealth, his generosity, and his ability to provide. The crowd's response to the games was a direct measure of his standing with the public, which in the political logic of Rome, where the relationship between rulers and the population was managed in part through the public performance of generosity and the public performance of gratitude, was a genuinely significant data point. Emperors who gave good games were popular. Emperors who gave poor games, or worse, who failed to give games at all, were expressing either poverty or contempt, neither of which the Roman public was inclined to forgive. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, which Juvenal uses as a critique of the Roman public's satisfaction with material comfort and entertainment, is usually quoted as a cynical observation about manipulation, but it's equally an accurate description of a political contract. The ruler provides, the public acknowledges, and the relationship is maintained through the performance of this exchange in spaces like the arena. The architecture of the amphitheatre was itself a political statement. The Colosseum, which was begun under Vespasian and completed under Titus, was built on the site of the private lake of Nero's Golden House, his famously extravagant private palace, and the choice of that location was deliberate. The message was explicit. What was private and exclusive has been made public and shared. The space that served one man's pleasure now serves everyone's. This message was understood by the Romans who received it, and it was the kind of message that a new dynasty, one that had followed a disastrous and hated emperor, found particularly useful. The Colosseum was propaganda made in concrete and stone, an argument in architecture about the difference between Nero's regime and the one that followed it. That it was also a functional entertainment venue of extraordinary engineering sophistication was a bonus. The Romans were very good at making things that worked and made arguments at the same time. The aftermath of the gladiatorial spectacle, the period after the event itself was over, also tells you something about how the institution was embedded in Roman social life. The bodies of the dead had to be removed, a task that fell to specific attendants whose role was to verify death and clear the arena between events. This was accomplished with a certain theatrical formality. Attendants dressed as Mercury, the god who conducted souls to the underworld, moved through the arena checking the fallen and removing those who were confirmed dead. This ritual incorporation of religion into what was also a logistical necessity is characteristic of Rome's approach to public life generally. The continuous overlay of religious meaning onto practical activity, which served both to dignify the activity and to reinforce the sense that what was happening in the arena was not simply violence, but something participated in by the larger cosmological order. Whether the Romans believed this literally is a complex question. Whether they found it useful is not. Survivors, both the victors and those spared by the crowd's decision, returned to the ludus for recovery. A fighter who had won a demanding match might be genuinely injured in ways that required significant medical attention, and the investment in that care was, as we have discussed, commercially justified. But there was also something else in the return to the ludus after a significant performance, something that the gladiatorial accounts touch on without quite naming. The particular experience of having survived something that was designed to potentially kill you, and finding yourself still present, still functional, still inside the system. Gladiators who survived long enough built reputations, and those reputations were themselves a form of currency, creating crowd interest and therefore commercial value, and therefore better conditions within the institution. The fighter who became known, who was recognized by name by the crowd, who had followers among the spectators who came specifically to see him, had leverage that anonymous beginners did not. This was the gladiatorial career in its most developed form, not simply an endless grinding repetition of dangerous events, but a trajectory with better conditions at the end of it than at the beginning, if you survived long enough to reach that end. What does any of this tell us about Rome? It tells us about a civilization that was sophisticated enough to build an industry around its most extreme public entertainment, and pragmatic enough to run that industry on commercial logic, even while dressing it in the language of virtue and civic spirit. It tells us about a people who could watch something genuinely dangerous and genuinely skilled and respond to both dimensions simultaneously, who were capable of appreciating technical excellence in a context that was also capable of producing death, and who did not experience these as contradictions. It tells us about the relationship between spectacle and power in a world where managing public sentiment was understood as a serious governmental responsibility, and the tools for doing so were developed with considerable sophistication. The gladiatorial games were not simply what they looked like from the outside. They never were. What they were, underneath the noise and the crowd and the specific terrible beauty of skilled combat under mortal pressure, was a machine for managing public feeling, a machine for demonstrating power and generosity, a machine for producing and sustaining the careers of professionals who are both more and less than the images their performances created. And like all machines, they reveal their makers in the details of their construction. What the gladiatorial career looked like from the inside, from the perspective of someone who entered the ludus and began the long process of becoming a fighter, is something the ancient sources only partially illuminate, largely because the people whose perspective would be most interesting, the gladiators themselves, were not the ones writing things down. What we have instead is the institutional record, the contracts and legal documents and inscriptions, combined with the medical texts and the archaeological evidence of the cemeteries, and from these fragments a picture emerges that is more complicated than either the romantic version of the doomed hero or the simple version of the exploited slave. The initial period of training at a ludus was intensely physical. New recruits, whatever their origin, whatever physical condition they arrived in, were put through a process of conditioning designed to produce a specific kind of body and a specific kind of skill. The doctors taught the fundamental techniques of their assigned fighting type, the footwork and body positioning and weapon handling that distinguished competent gladiatorial combat from simple brawling, and they taught it through repetition against wooden practice posts called palus, the same method used in Roman military training and for the same reason. Repetition against a fixed target builds muscle memory before the complications of an actual moving opponent are introduced. The training was long, and the process of becoming actually ready for arena combat was measured in months, sometimes over a year for fighters who were being trained in the more technically demanding specializations. During this time, the recruit ate the prescribed diet, followed the prescribed routine, and began to develop the physical characteristics of the professional gladiator, which were not the sleek musculature of the idealized athlete, but something denser and more specifically adapted, heavy in the torso and limbs, well padded with subcutaneous tissue, with strong hands and a particular quality of balance and body awareness that came from training to fight in ways that prioritized not being killed over looking aesthetically impressive. The first arena appearance was understood to be genuinely dangerous in a way that later appearances might be slightly less so, because an unknown fighter had no reputation to protect him. The crowd's attachment to a particular gladiator, their interest in seeing him again, was one of the practical pressures that pushed towards sparing a skilled fighter who lost, and a fighter making his debut had no such attachment working in his favour. The primus palus, the first among the fighters in a ludus, the most senior and most respected gladiator, was at the opposite end of this spectrum, someone whose reputation was sufficiently established that the crowd had a real investment in continuing to see him, which provided a form of protection that was imperfect but real. The arc from unknown recruit to recognized fighter was the basic narrative structure of a gladiatorial career, and it was an arc organised around survival and the accumulation of performance credit with the audience. The retirement of a successful gladiator was marked by the presentation of the rudis, the wooden practice sword that symbolised release from the obligation to fight. A gladiator who received the rudis was no longer required to enter the arena, had in some sense earned his way through the system to the other side of it. Some retired gladiators became doctors themselves, training the next generation of fighters in the skills they had spent their fighting years developing. This is the career arc that the gladiatorial system held out as its version of a successful outcome. You enter as a novice, you learn, you fight, you survive, you build reputation, and you eventually exit into a role that uses your expertise without requiring you to continue risking your life. The fact that most gladiators did not live to see this arc completed does not diminish the significance of the arc as a structure. It was real, it happened, and its existence tells you that the gladiatorial system was not simply a death machine, but something more complicated, an institution with its own internal logic of career and achievement and exit, operating within conditions of violence that made all of it precarious, but that did not eliminate the underlying structure. The Lannister's relationship with his gladiators was in every practical sense a commercial relationship, and the ethics of it were those of commercial relationships in Roman slave society generally, which is to say that it combined real financial investment in human beings as assets, with a complete legal disregard for their status as persons with interests of their own. The Lannister needed his gladiators to perform well, which meant he needed them to be trained, healthy, properly equipped, and psychologically functional enough to fight competently. All of these needs created pressure toward providing conditions that, relative to the conditions of other slaves in Roman society, were not uniformly terrible. Gladiators were fed substantially. They had medical care. They had structured social lives within the ludus. They had, in the form of training and discipline, and the clear structure of the institution, something that was genuinely different from the pure exploitation of agricultural slavery, which is not to say it was good, only that it was different in its specific character and in the specific demands and provisions that came with it. The beast hunts, the venationets, which typically occupied the morning portion of a day's events in the amphitheatre before the gladiatorial combat took place in the afternoon, represent another dimension of the games that complicates the simple narrative of pure violence. The logistical operation required to bring exotic animals to Rome from across the empire and beyond, to house them and feed them and move them through the amphitheatre's elaborate underground systems and into the arena at the appropriate moment, was itself an enterprise of considerable complexity. Lions and leopards from North Africa, bears from the forests of northern Europe, exotic animals from sub-Saharan Africa and Arabia and India, some of which had never been seen in Rome before and whose appearance in the arena was a statement about the reach of Roman power and commerce as much as it was entertainment. The animal trade that supplied the games was an enormous commercial operation, employing hunters and trappers and handlers and ship crews and overland transporters and veterinarians of a kind, men who understood enough about the physiology of large, dangerous animals to keep them alive and functional for a journey that might take months. The Colosseum's underground infrastructure, the Hippodrome, was a marvel of engineering specifically designed to support the mechanics of the spectacle. Elevators powered by counterweights could raise animals, sets, and fighters directly up into the arena floor through trapdoors, creating the impression of sudden appearance that the audience found thrilling. Corridors and passages allowed the movement of animals and personnel between their holding areas and the arena without the complex choreography of moving everything through the same access points. The drainage system handled the material consequences of a day's events. The retractable awning system, the velarium, which required teams of sailors to operate because its rigging system was borrowed from naval practice, shaded the audience from the Italian sun. All of this was not just infrastructure. It was the mechanical backbone of a theatrical experience, and the Romans maintained it with the seriousness of people who understood that the spectacle depended on the machinery working correctly. The social geography of the Colosseum audience was itself a structured system. Seating was allocated by social rank, with the most desirable positions close to the arena floor reserved for senators and other high-status individuals, and the upper tiers occupied by the lower ranks of Roman society, women generally seated separately and at the back. This arrangement meant that the gladiatorial event was not just entertainment, but a public display of Roman social hierarchy, with everyone positioned in their correct place in relation to the emperor and to each other. the whole audience forming a legible map of Roman society in its officially sanctioned order. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The Emperor's Box, the pulvinar, was the centre of the structure, visible from every seat, and the Emperor's presence at the games was itself a significant part of the event's meaning. When he appeared, the crowd acknowledged him. When he gave his judgment on a fallen fighter, his decision was the crowd's decision ratified, or the crowd's will corrected depending on which way the judgment went. He was not just watching, he was participating, occupying the central role in a ritual that was also, in its way, a negotiation between ruler and ruled conducted in the most public possible space. The vendors in the amphitheatre were a feature of the experience that tends to be overlooked in accounts focused on the combat itself. Food and drink were sold in the seating areas. Programs or lists of the day's scheduled fighters were available, which implies a certain degree of advanced planning and administrative organisation of what might otherwise seem like chaotic violence. Souvenir objects connected to popular fighters, small oil lamps or terracotta figurines depicting famous gladiators were sold and collected, the ancient equivalent of sports merchandise, which tells you that the relationship between fans and their favourite performers extended beyond the arena event itself into the domestic spaces of private life. A gladiator who was famous enough to appear on someone's dinner lamp was a genuinely public figure, recognised and admired in a way that crossed the formal social stigma attached to the profession and created a kind of celebrity that was awkward to acknowledge officially but functioned effectively in practice. The written record of gladiatorial contests, which we have from graffiti, from inscriptions, from legal documents managing the contracts between Lannistae and event organisers, and from literary sources, collectively reveals a world of professional management and record-keeping that would not look out of place alongside the documentation of any modern professional sport. Fighters' win-loss records were tracked. Match outcomes were noted on commemorative inscriptions. The terms of gladiatorial contracts were legally binding and enforced by the courts. Prize money was regulated. All of this suggests not an industry that operated in a legal and social grey area where anything went, but one that had been incorporated into the Roman legal and commercial framework in ways that provided structure and predictability for everyone involved, including the gladiators themselves. The gladiator who had a contractual relationship with the Lannister had legal rights within that contract, rights that could theoretically be enforced, which does not mean those rights were always respected, but does mean they existed in a form that the legal system recognised. Rome was, even in its most extreme entertainments, a society organised around law. The Roman physician Galen, who spent years as the doctor at the gladiatorial school in Pergamon before his career brought him to Rome and eventually to the imperial court, wrote extensively about his experiences treating gladiatorial injuries, and his accounts give us one of our most direct windows into what this work actually involved. He was proud of his record of keeping fighters alive, noting that no gladiator under his care died of their wounds, a claim that may contain some rhetorical inflation but that also reflects a genuine commitment to the outcomes of his medical work. He developed techniques for treating wounds to the chest and abdomen, for managing blood loss, for setting and splinting broken bones, for cleaning and binding wounds against infection, that represented genuine advances over standard Roman medical practice, and he developed them precisely because his patients were valuable enough that their survival mattered to the people paying his salary. Medical progress, in this particular case, came from the commercial logic of the arena. Keeping expensive gladiators alive was financially motivated. The techniques that made it possible were medically significant. This is not a comfortable origin story for advances in trauma medicine, but it is the actual one. The crowd that watched the games was responding to something real, and that reality was the genuine skill and courage of the men in the arena. Whatever the surrounding conditions, whatever the commercial machinery and the political calculation, and the systematic exploitation of human beings that made the spectacle possible, what happened in the sand was a genuine contest between trained professionals, conducted under conditions of real risk, requiring the application of real expertise under real pressure. The fighters who performed well earned the crowd's genuine admiration, not its pity, and the distinction mattered to the Romans who made it. Gladiators were in fames, legally degraded, socially below the threshold of respectability, and simultaneously admired figures whose names appeared on walls and whose images decorated everyday objects. Rome held both of these things about the same people simultaneously, without apparent discomfort, because Rome was very good at holding contradictions that the official categories were not equipped to resolve. There is a thread that runs through everything we have moved through tonight, from the narrow street outside your insula in the morning dark, through the quiet, professional competence of a woman who built a career in the most dangerous shadows of imperial power, through the relentless social scanning of a man who carries an entire city's connections inside his head, and through the carefully managed machinery of an industry that dressed itself in the appearance of pure spectacle while running itself with the logic of a business. The thread is this: Rome was not what it appeared to be, not the streets, which looked like chaos but followed their own rhythms, not the court, which looked like power but was threaded through with fragility and violence and the permanent fear of being replaced, not the nomenclator's senator, who looked like a man who knew everyone but was actually the temporary beneficiary of a slave's exhausted memory, not the arena, which looked like appetite but was actually engineering. What the Romans were extraordinarily good at, perhaps better than any civilization before or since, was the production of surfaces. They built the most impressive surfaces the ancient world had ever seen, in marble and law and spectacle and military organization, and behind those surfaces they conducted the actual business of living, which was as complicated and as morally ambiguous and as full of ordinary suffering as the actual business of living always is. The man in the insula climbing his stairs in the dark, the woman who knew too much and was therefore kept close until she was not, the slave whose expertise was invisible precisely because it worked so well, the gladiator eating barley and receiving medical care as a matter of commercial investment rather than human dignity. These are not the Romans of the history books, they are the Romans of the actual day, the ones who were busy and tired and pragmatic and occasionally brilliant and frequently frightened, and always inside a system that was much larger than any individual and which continued regardless of what any individual felt about it. History tends to keep the surfaces. The columns are still standing, the laws are still cited, the military tactics are still studied. What disappears is the texture, the smell of the street, the weight of the list of names, the moment someone makes a calculation about whether their expertise makes them valuable or dangerous, the sound of an enormous crowd deciding together whether someone lives. Those things are harder to preserve. They leave traces in graffiti and medical texts and legal records and the bones found under excavated streets, and those traces, patiently assembled, give us something closer to what it actually was. Tonight has been an attempt at that closeness. Not the Rome of triumphs and grand speeches, the Rome of the morning light coming through a window in an apartment building that might or might not survive the year. The Rome of expertise kept quietly and used carefully and never publicly acknowledged. The Rome of a man standing at someone else's left shoulder, whispering names. The Rome of a crowd of tens of thousands watching something carefully manufactured to look like pure chaos, cheering with absolute sincerity at a performance most of them never quite looked at directly enough to see for what it was. You have been inside that world tonight, moving through its layers. You know a little more of it now than you did before the lights went down, and that, in the particular quiet of wherever you are right now, in whatever version of a room this is for you, in whatever city whose sounds are pressing gently against your window is enough. The history is in you now, resting alongside everything else you are carrying. Let it settle. Let the names and the streets and the long Roman afternoon drift and soften. The Tiber is still flowing, somewhere in the deep past, and the city is settling into its nighttime version, the one where the carts are rolling and the stones are damp, and the windows of the insula glow faint above the street. Let that image carry you now. The day is done, the list can wait. Rest. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.